Hello. So in the last video, at the end of part one, we were talking about example questions and the importance of coming up with a list of questions to generate about the work that you are writing your literary analysis on. In this case, which will be Alice Walker's story, Everyday Use, and a discussion of the Sanford and Son episode, Lamont Goes African. So just to review, these were a list of possible questions I came up with, but I want you to generate your own. That's going to be very important because it's your essay, all right? And you're the one that's going to have to come up with the answers to your questions, which brings us to our next step. So what should you be thinking about once you've generated your list of questions? Here's the part where it gets good, because unfortunately it's not going to be enough just to raise the questions. You've got to go through and determine which questions that you have a pretty good idea you can answer. And as I said here, ideally, you should narrow this to a list of questions you feel somewhat confident you can answer. So that's where that weeding down process will occur. Remember, I said in the beginning, just throw out as many questions as you can think up, but at some point, you're going to have to make some decisions about which questions ultimately will and will not work for your purpose. And again, there's a few things to consider when you start thinking about which questions you're going to keep, which questions you're going to throw out. All right, let's move on to the next slide. You should, for example, eventually weed out any questions you're not certain about. Let's say you raise the question, but you're not sure you could answer that question. Because again, the essay must do that. The essay must provide the answer to that question. Or let's say you come up with a question, but you can't arrive at that answer by looking at the clues that the work itself provides. Then that's a clue that you have a bad question. Oh, I shouldn't say a bad question, because again, all questions are valid. But it just means you have a question that you're not going to be able to prove by looking at the evidence that the story gives. So those, yeah, you'll want to weed those out eventually, because that is the next step. You've got to answer your own questions. So here might be some examples of how you would format that. All right, so I just picked a couple of random questions here and then thought about how I could answer those. For example, question: why do Lamont and Dee try to change their names? Answer: by changing their names, they are trying to prove their devotion to their newfound Africanism by taking on new identities. Now, that may or may not work overall as a thesis, but it gives you a good start in the right direction. All right. So once you've raised the question, can you provide the answer? Or question: why do both Mama and Fred reject these name changes? Answer, or at least one way you could think about that answer. In the parents' view, their children's names represent family history and are not merely slave names as their children insist. So all I've done here is I've, come up with a couple of questions, and then I've provided in about 1 to 2 sentences how I would respond to that question. That's what I will expect from you, okay? So I will want you to generate your questions and then give me your answer. How would you respond to that question? Because the next step there is now you're going to invert your responses. Once you complete that inversion, you've actually arrived at a thesis. You've arrived at an arguable statement that your paper can work to prove. So let's see how that looks in action. So remember, again, all we've done is we've taken our question, we've looked at our answer, now we have flipped that so that we have a statement based on that answer. By changing their names, Lamont and Dee are trying to prove their devotion to their newfound Africanism by taking on new identities. So maybe that essay is going to argue the importance of those new identities, for example. Or, according to Mama and to Fred, their children's names represent family history and are not merely slave names, as their children insist. So maybe the goal of this essay will be to defend the, the reaction of the parents, why they are so strongly opposed to these name changes. So, again, the first response there might be looking at the reasons why the kids, I call them kids, but they're not really kids, they're young adults, but why do the young adults in these stories try to change their names? All right, so maybe we want to explore that. Or conversely, we might be looking at exploring why the parents react the way that they do. And either one could make for a good thesis. Either one could be a good point to argue for a paper like this. Some words of caution. As you brainstorm your initial questions, eliminate any questions that only lead to very obvious answers. And again, this is hard because, when you start to generate that list, I don't want you to feel like you've got to censor yourself, but the ultimate goal is that you'll have to start deciding which questions you're going to keep, which ones are going to get thrown out. And you don't want to keep any questions that are just going to lead you to a dead end. If you can answer that question too quickly, or if the answer to that question is just something that anyone who reads that story or anyone who watches Lamont Goes African, if it's an answer that every reader would come to the same conclusion, or every viewer, that's not going to make for a good thesis, because it's not going to be debatable enough or arguable enough to really sustain your argument for the duration of this paper. You don't want anything that's just going to lead you to a plot summary. So I gave you an example here. This would not be a good thesis. In everyday use in Lamont Goes African, we see two young people during the Black Power movement in conflict with their parents about what heritage means. Again, not a good thesis for this essay. And the reason why, you can't go anywhere with that other than to summarize what the two stories are about. And we already know that, and we don't need to know that in your essay. Again, the goal is not going to be just to retell the story. You assume you're writing for a reader who already knows the story. All right, they don't need to be told what happens. What they're looking for from you is some ideas about why certain things happen the way that they do in the story. So avoid this. It's what I sometimes call, based on an old textbook I used to teach from, they call this the too factual thesis because it just leads you to fact. It just leads you to summary, which is not going to be effective for you in the long run.